Good morning, everybody. Happy rainy Monday, and it's great to see all of you on our newest Espresso with Carlo installment. We are very excited to have everybody back again this morning, and I think this is going to be a great panel. Clearly, we're living in a world where online access is more important than we ever thought, and therefore it's critical that we make investments in connectivity. One thing we've always talked about is that infrastructure is not just things you can see built in front of you, but what we're doing today is part of important infrastructure. And I think we all need to work together on that. That obviously includes the implementation of 5G, which will help provide high-speed connectivity for New Yorkers and strengthen our economy. Today's panel of experts will discuss exactly what 5G means for New Yorkers and how it impacts our day-to-day lives. And again, I think more and more we're living in a world where the impact of this is really taken a whole new meaning. It's been a tough year, as we all know. I think we are seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. A little over an hour ago, the first New Yorker was given the vaccine, and that is something to celebrate and something to be very excited about. And I think we can all take at least 1 minute today to celebrate that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Let me welcome our moderator for this morning's panel, Caitlin Bruckner from New Yorkers for 5G, and our wonderful panelist, John Gilbert from Rudin Management. And I should add that John co-chairs our Energy Committee at the Building Congress. John, thank you for all that you do. Tom Gretsch, President and CEO of the Queens Chamber of Commerce. I always say Tom represents my second favorite borough, but Tom, you're doing a great job. And Victoria Lambert from ZenFi Networks. Victoria, thank you for all that you do. Before I turn it over to the panel, let me just say that we are excited that our next Espresso with Carlo, which will actually be our final one for 2020, will happen next Monday, December 21st at 3 p.m. And that will be with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who will be talking about what's in store for the next few weeks in Washington, stimulus, infrastructure, and transition into the Biden administration. So I thank all of you for all you do. Enjoy the panel, and I will turn it over to the moderator. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carlo, and a big thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. 5G is an incredibly timely and important topic, as we all know, so I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right in. For everybody watching, I think it would be helpful to start with the fundamentals of really why we're here today. So Victoria, I know that Carlo touched on this a bit, but can you just provide an overview of what 5G is and discuss the role that ZenFi Networks plays in really making it a reality?
Sure. So thanks for having me today. I'm Victoria Lambert, Chief Revenue Officer of ZenFi Networks, one of the founders of the businesses. We're a communications infrastructure business here in the New York, New Jersey region, and we provide underlying fiber optic network connectivity, neighborhood network edge colocation, and wireless siting in support of the mobile network operators' needs for deployment of 4G and 5G. So I think you're starting right at the right point here. 5G is the 5th generation of the mobile network standard, right? It's an evolution of the network, and the promise of 5G is ultra low latency, multi-gigabit bandwidth speeds, ultra accessible network. Really means for us consumers a more resilient and more robust network experience. When we talk about it today, often it's talked about as almost 4G on steroids. So the idea that, when we're connected to our devices, our Zoom experience, telehealth, remote learning experiences, all of those would be much better. But 5G promises much more than that. And just as we really never could have imagined some of the technologies that evolve from the first cellular networks all the way up to the fourth generation. I don't think anyone, when they were connected to their car phone, thought about Uber as an app and the ability that they would have in their phone to work remotely at all hours of the day. That same kind of future, we don't know the exact result of what 5G will bring, but we know that it is a step function in the network itself. What we do and what companies like Zenfi do in support of 5G is we provide the neutral underlying infrastructure that allows 5G to work. So when we talk about deploying the network, and the carriers are talking about deploying these 5G networks, in order to make those deployments a reality, they need to have sites to put radios on top of. Those sites are being deployed in what we consider an ultra dense network environment today. So you're talking about sites every couple hundred of feet. Each one of those radios needs a physical location to go on. It needs power, it needs fiber. So there's a tremendous investment that the carriers need to make in underlying infrastructure to allow this rollout to happen. And there's simply not enough budget for each of the carriers to deploy these networks fully themselves. So companies like ours, Crown Castle, XNet, step in to help provide that neutral infrastructure.
Thank you. That was really useful, and I think helps set us the stage for what we're here to really talk about today. So as a coalition, we've been seeing all these reports out there on the importance of 5G and its ability to strengthen New York's economy. So Tom, I'd love to hear from you. How, in your mind, does the broad implementation of 5G help strengthen the economy, especially as the state begins to recover from COVID?
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. And Carlo, thanks especially for your mentorship and your leadership during our time of need in the city of New York. I think when the history books are written, your leadership and that of your organization will be front and center. So thank you. So Queens is a home of about, we have 1,300 members representing about 125,000 Queens-based employees. And 90% of those folks have 10 or fewer employees. The word of the year besides pandemic and COVID probably has been pivot. So at the end of the day, when these companies have never really had a need or a desire to be digital or virtual in any way, needed to do that. So a small restaurant, a small bodega, anybody out there selling food, for example, had to go and have some kind of online activity. And in certain areas of our city, we've talked about food deserts and transportation deserts. There's clearly a tech desert where there's not access to folks. And as we need to build out these different protocols and build out additional services for folks in the small business sector, they need access to tried and true availability to be able to connect to the internet. And that's an important part of what we're trying to do, an important part of why we joined this coalition in the first place.
Thank you. And Victoria or John, do you guys have anything to add on the job creating and then the revenue generating potential of 5G and how that might impact the big picture in New York going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in here. From a high level, I think the latest stat I read from Qualcomm is the expectation is 5G will generate 13 trillion in economic output, 22 million new jobs created. So we're talking about something substantial in terms of this step function here. When I bring it down to what I consider the tangible level, I think about this in terms of jobs today and jobs tomorrow. So jobs today, as I mentioned, this investment in 5G infrastructure is massive. And to put this in an order of magnitude for the group here, we estimate there's about 10,000 sites either reserved or deployed today for 4G and future 5G sites across the city. And the carriers are expecting hundreds of thousands of these sites to be deployed. So we're in the very early innings here of this deployment. Each one of those sites requires physical individuals, construction crews, splicers, engineers going out picking up a site, putting a new antenna up, civil crews digging up the streets, bringing power, bringing fiber there, connecting it all back. And then in the back office, we're talking about project management jobs, engineering jobs. So there are real jobs today available in this field as we expand this 5G pervasive network. When I talk about the jobs of the future, that's where I go back to this concept of innovation. And when you have an underlying network and infrastructure in the city that allows for small businesses to take advantage of connectivity, to pivot when they need to, for entrepreneurs to take advantage of the next great thing, that's when we see a real true growth in jobs and innovation. And I think that is the exciting piece of 5G. The last thing I would say here, and it speaks a bit to Tom's point, is in order to get a truly pervasive 5G infrastructure, and again, I'll focus this in New York because that's what we're talking about today, the carriers are talking about blanketing the city and the need to blanket the city with these sites. And I touched on it already, but if you're deploying a 5G node on a street pole, that street pole needs to have underlying fiber optic connectivity to it. So what that means is here in New York City, we're building the next best in class underlying infrastructure of fiber optic networks, not just that these carriers can take advantage of, but more importantly, I think in this conversation about bridging the digital divide, local businesses can take advantage of, the city can take advantage of, virtual network operators can take advantage of. It will allow an increase of carriers to come to market to provide alternative price points and offerings to the consumers. So all of that infrastructure that's being put in the ground to support 5G, I think the important point to focus on is it can all be leveraged for these other applications that ultimately help truly bridge this divide.
Yeah, I think, a wise person once told me you can never have too much bandwidth. And I think, that's really what we're talking about here. You go back to the early days of Silicon Alley in Lower Manhattan, and when we did 55 Broad Street, we were bringing optical fiber to the desktop for the first time ever. No one had even thought about it. No one had ever even figured out how to do it. But I think, the 5G, I think there's a little bit of an issue with 5G in that the hype of 5G is way out in front of the actual delivery of the product. And I think what's really interesting, Caitlin, when you look at what the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, did in early part of this year in January, they did something that they've never done before, which is to deliver an amazing gift to property owners across the United States. And what they did is that they deregulated 150 megahertz of wireless spectrum in the 3.5 to 3.7 gigahertz range, and said to property owners, hey, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, here's a license for your buildings for indoor wireless connectivity that you can then leverage for your own use and for the use of your customers. Unbelievable. It's called CBRS, Citizens Broadband Radio Spectrum. The ability to take this spectrum and ultimately partner with a carrier or partner with a Zenfi or a Crown Castle or an Extenet, Geoverse is out there in this space, to partner, to bring and to accelerate the deployment of 5G within our office buildings and within our apartment buildings to deliver an amazing new level of service to our customers. This will accelerate 5G faster than anything else. And let's just look at what that means from a value standpoint. So the FCC went out and sold a bunch of the spectrum. They raised $4.5 billion. $4.5 billion was raised for people who wanted to buy the spectrum, and every property owner in the United States of America has the right for free to leverage that license and leverage that spectrum. and enhance our ability to do robotic parking, to enhance our ability to deliver, amazing amounts of bandwidth into our lobbies, which our lobbies will no longer be what they used to be, which were pass-throughs. They are now collection points, whether it's for thermal scanning or whether it's for, understanding the lobby condition as far as, okay, how long is it going to take me if I'm queuing up and I can only put 4 people on an elevator, I'm going to have queues in my lobby. Well, I need to be able to deliver bandwidth for the people who are actually waiting on those lines. So here's an opportunity to get into all the Internet of Things, to deliver from cell service to robotics to you name it, via a network that property owners have a license for free.
Caitlin, can I weigh in here with a comment too, to John's comments as well?
Of course.
So he dated himself a little bit, but it rang a bell with me when he mentioned Silicon Alley. I can very vividly remember in the financial and printing business doing IPOs in that area with John. You probably remember Jason Calacanis from that time frame. But John's exactly right. He's spot on. With so much uncertainty out there in the business community, whether we're going to convert office buildings to apartment buildings and all the one thing that's tried and true, and that one thing that is a certainty, is the need for more broadband. I mean, there's not much else we can depend upon right now. And I'm going to make a little plug for Queens in the sense of this. We were lucky and fortunate to get our Flushing waterfront project blessed and approved by City Council 39-5 last week. That's going to be 1,700 units, a hotel, some common spaces, and a transformation of the waterfront. That's a big deal for us in lots of ways, but also the needs of our places. As buildings get rebuilt and reconfigured, the days of having things wired per se are over, and we need to have the access about whether it's a personal space, a residential space, a manufacturing space. There's a lot of efforts underway to transform downtown Jamaica. There's thousands of units being built down there. With the advent of this vaccine that Carlos mentioned today being administered in New York City and Queens, I think we've turned the corner, but we've got to plan for scale, and we've got to get the city engaged in understanding the importance of this. We cannot become too big. We cannot become a second banana to anybody when it comes to this thing. If we're going to go out there and try to get companies, domestic and international, to think about coming to New York City, we've got to be able to showcase the technology availability for each and every one of them. And that's a really, really important thing that I think we have to impart on our elected officials.
I agree completely. And actually, John, I want to go back to you for a moment. One thing that you were speaking to is really this convergence of technology and real estate. Can you speak a little bit more to the immediate benefits that you see to improve connectivity in both commercial real estate as well as residential real estate industry, and then also just any innovations you see coming down the pike?
Sure. So real estate's been kind of late to this game in terms of the extraction of data out of its built environments, and then using that data ultimately to make data-driven decisions on electrical consumption, steam consumption, water consumption, occupancy, delivery of proper amount of air conditioning. And so in 2009, the Rudin family embarked on a unique endeavor, which was to launch a software company that did all this. So we've actually created a brain for buildings. It's called Nantum. Nantum's derived from an ancient Algonquin word that means prayer or blessing. And we really look at this new brain for buildings as a true blessing because it answered our prayers. We needed a single integrated platform that allowed all the data that we were collecting to come to a single place. So now that we're actually controlling our chillers and our fan distribution systems by measuring that and correlating that against occupancy. So our consumption curve is no longer a typical bell-shaped curve, but is actually a double hump camel. And in the middle of the day, as people go to lunch, we're able to modulate fan speed. And this is all driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we can save an enormous amount of energy simply by not blowing our fans at 100% capacity as people leave for lunch. And I don't know about you, but how many of you, of any of us, have come back from lunch and our offices have been freezing? And that's the result, is that we're not modulating that fan speed. So what we know is that the next frontier of this is, how do we work with our customers, our large tenants in our office buildings, to get them engaged in the ability to look at the consumption of energy, to modify their behavior, and to create sustainable corporate strategies. And the key piece to that, Caitlin, is collecting as granular the amount of data as granularly as we possibly can. So as we try to do that, we start bumping up against other people's Wi-Fi networks, because we think that this, buildings have always had a heart, engine room, boiler room. Now they have a brain, Nantum. Final frontier is the central nervous system. And ultimately, the central nervous system is driven through sensors, both wired and wireless, that bring the data back to the brain, that Nantum then is able to analyze this data and push forward predictive and prescriptive actions that owner should be taking, not only to enhance the experience of that customer, but also to decrease the amount of energy that they consume and to decrease the amount of carbon that they produce. So the ability to do that all comes down to the granularity of data. What's the best solution out there? 5G. And a CBRS enabled building that accelerates the deployment of 5G, because you put in that data vacuum cleaner, if you will, that can cover the entire building and go into tenant spaces without any interference whatsoever. So these are hugely valuable tools that, as Tom talked about, New York's got to stand up and say, this is what we represent, this is what we stand for. And guess what? The smartest companies, the best technologists, the real estate industry is working with these folks to integrate this technology back into our buildings. So if you're a company that cares about your carbon, if you're a company that cares about your sustainability strategy, then come to New York, because we're all over it.
So I think that's a really important point that you're hitting on, the environmental kind of aspect, the decreasing carbon. So what role in your mind do you see the real estate industry playing in helping to improve the environment?
It's a huge responsibility of ours. The local law 97 that was passed by the council and signed by the mayor is a law that will put enormous amounts of responsibility on property owners to control the actions of their tenants, which they currently have no control over, and for the foreseeable future don't have any control over. So how do we do that? We do that simply by creating an infrastructure, ultimately that will allow data to be collected, analyzed, and then shared with our customers, so that they can see ultimately the impact that they have on the particular building in which they work or live, and then ultimately how that feeds into the city as a whole. Hugely important. The only way we can meet the mandates of local law 97 is if property owners and tenants work together. Can't do it any other way.
Caitlin, I just want to add one thing to what John's saying here too, is that a lot of this rests on the ability to leverage open architectures, neutral infrastructure, and John mentioned CBRS, which I think is a perfect example of what we consider democratized spectrum, right? And so the more that we can open up the networks themselves, the underlying infrastructure themselves, the more efficient we can be with these resources, pooling them together. And as John said, now we're not using and using inefficient use of resources at data centers within the buildings themselves. And I think that understanding the importance of that neutral component in building out our networks is critical to achieving a lot of the things that John just pointed out.
Comment there too, if I may, is that if a city, Queens would be the 4th largest city right behind our friends to the west in Brooklyn, I believe we have the most single family homes. John, I want to talk to you offline about the energy world. I have a very robust energy committee, but none of that matters unless we're connected. This isn't an energy conversation, it's a 5G conversation. But when you talk about things about energy aggregation and community solar and tying together in networks to have things communicate with each other, whether it's those single family homes in Queens that might have the solar on the roof, or in some way controlling the usage of energy we are embracing that local law that you mentioned in a positive way. In that when you get lemons, make lemonade, and we're doing our best to do that. But it takes the infrastructure, it takes the technology to tie all those resources together with the big utilities, with individual businesses, and we're very bullish about that. And I think that the missing thing right now in our city, I hate to harp on it, but is the connectivity and the support broadly of our electeds to get this thing done.
So I know all of you guys have been talking a lot about increased connectivity, tying together networks. I know, John, you mentioned the idea of a smart building with an actual brain. So I guess to talk a little bit big picture, Victoria, how will the broad implementation of 5G help facilitate the creation of smart city initiatives across New York? So I know that idea is something that's really top of mind for many folks out there who think about the future. Many people think smart cities.
Yeah, so the way I look at this is I look at 5G and specifically the carrier investment in 5G as being the means to roll out the infrastructure that allows us to enable these smart city initiatives. And to give you an example of this, prior to Zenfi, I was part of a company, Lexington Metro Connect, which built fiber optic networks, and primarily did that in the 2000s. And when we built fiber networks at that point in time, we were building them all in Manhattan, pretty much connecting enterprise businesses because that's where the business was being driven. That's where the business case was being made. Fast forward to today, our major customers are the mobile network operators. Our network now, we have nearly 6 million feet of fiber optic network in the area. When I talk about my network in New York City, half of that is in the outer boroughs. That didn't happen 10, 15 years ago. That's being driven by this massive investment in 5G. And so the same poles that are being used to support these 5G radios can be used to support IoT sensors. The same fiber that's being delivered to that pole can be leveraged to support the local pilot fiber networks that's offering low-cost internet connectivity. The same neighborhood network co-location facility that is in Far Rockaway will be able to be leveraged by Netflix for edge caching and the like. And so when I don't think about 5G as being the solution to all of our challenges. I think about it as being the driver of underlying infrastructure that allows us to build as a city onto all of these other pieces. So I see it as I guess the component and the driver, but not necessarily the end game that is the smart city.
A comment to Victoria's well said comments. We talk about these big picture, large scale, smart city things. I want to bring it down a little bit to the level of the common man or woman in our city. Specifically in Queens, we have the most diverse place on earth with 175 nationalities and languages. We're a great melting pot here. But there are, again, technology deserts where they don't even have access to that service. Many folks have to flock to the local libraries. We have 64 in Queens County that go to the libraries for any kind of connectivity. It would truly be a shame to leave those folks behind in any way, shape, or form. We also are home to one of the largest NYCHA housing projects down in Queensbridge, not far from the 59th Street Bridge, where those folks need to have the services. We've learned the problems with online and asynchronous learning without access to some of these things. And if nothing else, besides the businesses and the high tech piece of the puzzle, we can't leave those folks that don't have the resources and frankly depend upon all these providers to deliver regular, unfettered internet access for them to do their daily chores, their schoolwork, and their commerce on a regular basis.
Yeah, and Kaylin, just back on this, one challenge we have in New York of achieving, this vision that we're all talking about here is the physical siting of places to put, whether it's 5G equipment, open Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, gigabit Wi-Fi that's available to citizens, neutral CBRS radios for offload. The city of New York, those all require wireless siting opportunities. And today we're using utility poles, street light poles. Frankly, this is street furniture that was never intended to be used for the purpose that we're trying to use it for. And if we want to truly enable this connectivity to the far reaches of the city, we need to work with the city to create new form factors that are purpose-built for telecommunications that can help deliver ultra high speed, open Wi-Fi for the community. They're wireless sighting points for 5G. And I think that that is something that I expect that we'll see as we move forward. I mean, I think that obviously we see these Link NYC kiosks in parts of the city. That was a first step, but we really need to go beyond that. And, I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that all of this connectivity requires some sort of wireless connection point. That wireless connection point always has to be connected back to a wire. And so we need to look at the city and work with the city just to physically find locations to put these all on.
So I guess to switch gears a little bit, and Tom, I want to talk to you because you mentioned earlier that all businesses, regardless of their size, have had to really rethink their operations during the pandemic. Can you speak to how next generation connectivity can help small businesses better compete, help level the playing field? And then, not to throw too many questions at you, but are there also any anecdotes that you're hearing that you think would be worth sharing with this group?
Sure, and thanks for that opportunity. So thanks to the generosity of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and the Partnership for New York City, the 5 chambers of commerce in our great city were given grant funds to go out and hire people to go knock on doors and do an assessment. That's a process that started in late September, early October, that will continue for the next year. And it's remarkable, some of the findings. So they're going out virtually in some cases, feet on the street in many other cases, knocking on doors, tapping on windows, and having conversations with the small people in our city who were affected greatly by this COVID. And what we're learning is a number of different things, right? People did not need to be digital or available to sell their wares, their food, their services online. And now we're seeing it. And the example I love to bring up, because I think she's terrific, is Mama's Empanadas in Queens, right? When you go to Mama's before the pandemic, there was a line of people there that went up and bought her empanadas because she's fantastic. When the pandemic came and we had to close things down, she struggled because there was a need for potentially an online menu, a point of sale at the store beyond just a cash purchase or minor credit card, right? And so we're out there trying to figure out what she needs for point of sale, both the hardware and the software. Does she have a website? Is she able to do e-commerce online to sell her wonderful world-class empanadas online? Does she utilize SEO? Does she utilize social media? All those things, many people today can run their business practically on their cell phone. But some of the bricks and mortars need the extra help. And again, none of that happens without access. And there's lots of places in certain parts of Queens, and I'm sure in other parts of our entire city where there's not access. And I think it's incredibly important that these folks have an ability to go out there and to operate within the confines of their neighborhoods, but opening their businesses up to the world.
So I think one topic that all of you guys have been touching on is this concept of the digital divide that exists right now. And as a result of the pandemic, there's now widespread acceptance, I think for really the first time, that online access, it's not a privilege, but it's truly a necessity for success in our increasingly digital world. But as you guys have all said, it's out of reach for millions of Americans, and including many in New York. So in your minds, how can you see 5G helping to close this digital divide? I know, Tom, that you mentioned has been exacerbated by COVID-19.
I think the thing to remember about 5G is that the more granular it gets, as Victoria talked, the more sites you need, right? You're literally slicing and dicing these cells that currently make up our wireless infrastructure into much smaller pieces. The fact that you go smaller, you can deliver a greater amount of bandwidth simply because you're getting rid of latency across that network. So absolutely, from an educational standpoint, I think, both Tom and Victoria talked about that. This is crucial. From an economic development standpoint, crucial. So the key piece is, what we need to do is look at everything that has to happen ultimately in order for these networks to be deployed. And let's identify the people who play a role in each of those steps and give them the resources that they need, give them a boot in the butt if they need it. Ultimately, this is why I'm so excited about CBRS, because as buildings begin to get lit up from the inside out, now that's going to create opportunities for all the street furniture that Victoria was talking about, because then those networks get linked. And as we look at the linkages of those networks, that's when we're going to finally get our arms around what needs to be done so this can be deployed. I mean, I think it's important. Everybody says, oh, data is the new oil, right? I look at that and I say, you know what? But it's crude oil. And unless there's software, smart software that can ultimately slice, dice, predict, and prescribe what that data tells us we should be doing, it's not very valuable. So yes, we need the infrastructure. Yes, we need 5G, but we also have to unleash, all of those smart minds, those software developers, to realize that there's opportunity along this new big pipe, wireless pipe, that opportunities can be made in terms of companies that can ultimately take advantage of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with John, and I said this earlier, but I see 5G as being, the driver here and a leader. And just as he mentioned of getting buildings up and connected, if you don't have 5G helping to push out a network to a far street corner, then you don't have the ability for the office building on that block to tap into that fiber network back at the manhole where it's accessible. So what I'm seeing is, from the infrastructure standpoint, this pervasive building of what really these new types of networks. These are networks that are being built, are neighborhood networks. They're co-located back to network data centers, neighborhood network co-location centers that we call neighborhood data centers. Those data centers have fiber reaching out to touch endpoints for 5G. The byproduct is now all of the office buildings, all of the community centers in that neighborhood are that much closer to tapping into the fiber optic network. So instead of having to pay, $200,000, $500,000 to build that network out from some other neighborhood, maybe you're talking about $10,000 to expand it. I mean, it's not zero still, but we're a lot closer. And then beyond the underlying fiber optic infrastructure, again, you've got that wireless site. So that wireless site maybe is being used today to deploy a cellular radio, but who says we can't put an access point up there that can connect into, a public Wi-Fi or community Wi-Fi network? Who says we can't put a CBRS radio up there that can allow, new entrants to compete with some of the larger carriers from an offload perspective to provide alternative cellular, connectivity in and around the area? That's where I see us bridging the divide, but it all comes from having the ability to push out neutral infrastructure into every capillary of the city. And until we do that, these businesses and these wholesale carriers can't take advantage of that to offer some of these incredible, connectivity solutions that we all want to see.
This has all been incredibly informative, so thank you. So as we look to the future and the statewide implementation of 5G, what do you all, and I'd love to hear from each of you, what do you see as the biggest roadblock to achieving the statewide implementation of 5G? And this could be trying to jump over the hurdle of all those misconceptions that exist out there. And I guess, Victoria, I'll start with you.
Yeah, we see a couple different challenges, from the perspective of working with, city government. Often we find that there are just not as many bodies as are needed to process a lot of the permits and paperwork to get these jobs up and running. So that's something that I would say we run into often. Obviously, cost of deployments are expensive. When you're talking about putting up a site, you're talking about usually reinforcing foundations, digging up street, bringing power, fiber, the light. So that's a huge endeavor. Cost the carriers tons of money to do that. So shared infrastructure really helps there. But from the perspective of building these out in our communities, one of the biggest barriers that we run into is the communities themselves being fearful of what it is that we're putting out on the street. You know, we are getting a lot of calls and questions about the health and safety of the radios that are being deployed. And there's a lot of misinformation. We try to refer back to the FCC. We try to provide, small points such as, the RF emissions that you're going to get from the small cell site, really equivalent to what you're getting from the microwave in your home. It's not equivalent to an X-ray, but those concerns are real. I always like to say, I'm a mom, I have 2 young kids. I totally understand being fearful about something that's new and different. I also understand wanting to make sure that what is outside your window is safe, that it looks nice. So I think those are real valid concerns that we need to hear from the community, but I also think it's incumbent upon our local officials to help educate that community and say, here's what it means from a safety perspective, here's what we're trying to do to reduce visual pollution, and here are the benefits that come along with extending these networks. And if there's one thing that I would like our officials to take away from this conversation, it would be helping to educate the communities to make it a little bit easier when we go and try to deploy this infrastructure.
And then John or Tom, anything you want to add on any of the roadblocks that we need to overcome?
This is blocking and tackling. All the real hard work in terms of envisioning what the 5G standard should be, in terms of understanding, what the opportunities are, that's all been done. So Victoria lays it out properly, which is, okay, what do we need to do? What are the 20 things that need to happen in order for this to roll out? And let's identify the people who ultimately have the ability to say yay or nay, and let's lobby them and let them know that they need to say yes, because it's the right thing for New York. And then ultimately to engage all aspects. This is something that, Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics are local. Back in the day, I think all telecommunications are local, right? If I can't access, and I have to this day still talk to the carriers about, hey folks, it's not about the last mile, it's about the first mile, because the network starts in your customer's home, in their apartment, in their office. So let's talk about deploying networks to them. They become the first mile, and let's identify the issues that we all need to hold hands on, which are the vast majority here, and get this stuff done. Blocking, tackling, get it done, identify who's needs to do what to whom, and let's go, because time is a wasting. Asia is beating us up pretty well on this in terms of getting 5G networks out there up and deployed. We need to do the same. We need to be able to compete.
I think to John's point as well, we've got to rally the troops no matter where they are, from the private sector, especially the not-for-profit world, the business world. This past weekend, I did a little binge watching, and I watched one of my favorites from the late 80s, Wall Street. And to see how those rooms operated with an old school cell phone that was probably as big as a shoe, not to mention the computers on their desks. I thought about how much, in anticipation of this call today, how much things have changed and the vast amounts of data. If we don't get our act together, as John kind of said and Victoria alluded to, if we don't get our act together, other cities in our country and other parts of our world are going to have us for lunch. And now is the time, as we're trying to turn the corner on what's going on in our country and in our city with this vaccine and the end of hopefully the end of the pandemic within line sight. We have got to get our act together. This won't be a snap of the fingers to get it done, but we certainly have to build that coalition of a lot of different players to lobby and to cajole and to convince our electeds and all those in charge to get this done as soon as possible.
Totally agree, Tom. And I also would say we have to remember that, the carriers are rolling this out throughout the nation, right? And if we want New York to be the first, we have to open up every single avenue to allow them to deploy. And every roadblock that we put up that makes it harder or more expensive for them to deploy in the city, they just take those dollars, they're going to spend it someplace else. Because there's plenty of places where these networks need to be built out. The investment is massive that needs to be done. And I completely agree, Tom. We need to be on the forefront, because if we're not, we're going to lose those dollars to build out. And I think that's something that we have to be very aware of, particularly in this environment where now people are working remote and moving. We want to keep people in New York.
So in all of your minds, what do you guys see as the policy changes that actually need to be made at both the state and local level in order to encourage and speed investment and make the statewide implementation of 5G a reality?
I mean, I can start, Caitlin, and I would say one of the biggest challenges we run into when we work with various municipalities is there's not a coherent set of rules that are adopted for rolling out these networks, for permitting and the like. I already mentioned there's also a lack of individuals available to process applications, which can be a real challenge and slows things down. I actually think New York City has done a pretty good job of creating a streamlined process for deploying these mobile networks. It's not perfect. It doesn't run at the speed I think that we all would like, including the city, to see. But the one thing that I think it has going for it is there's a underlying mobile telecom franchise, provides opportunity for all holders of that franchise to reserve sites across the city, which increases competition, should theoretically lower cost across the board. And it's clearly defined how you reserve sites, how you build them out, and provide some sort of predictable timeline. The more that we can roll out those models throughout the state and throughout the region, the better. Again, I come back to the carriers. The carriers have mandates to deploy 5G. They have budgets that they're trying to hold on to, and they've got timelines that they're trying to meet these in. And as as infrastructure providers, if we can't give them those timelines because we don't have clarity from the municipalities when we're going to get approvals for things, that creates a real challenge. And ultimately, the people who suffer are those in our communities, because these sites won't get built out and the timeline to deploy lags.
And in my mind, it's all about the messaging. Tom mentioned Mama's Empanadas. So multiply, Mama's Empanadas by you use whatever number you want to use. He mentioned Queensbridge houses in terms of public housing authorities. The ability to educate our young and to do that remotely requires bandwidth, and it requires a lot of bandwidth. So this is a moment. This is an endeavor. This is a journey that will impact every single New Yorker. And it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor or black or white or whatever the differentiator that you want to identify yourself with. This is good for you. This is good for New York. This is about jobs. This is about education. This is about remaining competitive with the rest of the world. So there shouldn't be anybody saying, not good for me, so I'm going to fight it, because this is good for everybody.
One of the things I just saw that popped up in the Q&A box as a comment, which I'm sure we'll get to, was about healthcare agencies and healthcare facilities. A place like Queens was a hospital desert, so to speak. I hate using that word desert all the time, but they exist. And in the last 5-10 years, we've had New York Presbyterian, Mount Sinai, NYU Langone, Northwell is here now, right? Not to mention the plethora of city MDs and all those dock-in boxes that have opened up that have basically been essential services for all of us the last 9 months. I'm always I'm shocked by the interaction of all these groups, the shared data, right? From one hospital system to another, from the city MD to the electronic medical records that have been developed over the last 5 to 10 years. That's another area that just came to mind about sharing that information during times of a pandemic. Now we have the vaccines to track and operate and so on. So I think there's so many areas of our lives that this is going to impact that I think the coalition has to be broad, that gets people to pay attention to this, and it really needs to be broad.
And speaking of the Q&A box, I want to touch on one of the questions that Liz Archer added to the chat. So I know we've been talking about all of these innovations enabled by 5G. What is the actual timeline here for when the infrastructure will be in place to make these all a reality?
I mean, I can start it. I think, you know, we're at the very, we always talk about this in terms of, you know, innings, and we're at the very early innings here of 5G. We expect to be deploying over the course of the next year or two, you know, extensive 5G sites throughout New York City as the start. But I don't think we're going to start to see the true meaning of pervasive 5G in what we're talking about in terms of transforming industries and transforming the enterprise and having the fully smart building experience for a couple years to come. And the reason for that is, as we said, you know, when you talk about sites deployed for 5G today or 5G suitable sites today, you know, the majority of sites or all the sites deployed today in New York are 4G LTE sites that need to be upgraded. The total number of those sites that is deployed plus reserved by carriers and neutral providers is only about 10,000. We already know there's over 100,000 that are going to have to be deployed, and that's just in the 5 boroughs of New York. So we've got a long way to go until we see the full promise of what's here. The positive, though, of that is we're going to see the incremental benefits come very quickly. And as we are able to deploy in neighborhoods, you're going to start seeing the benefits of that connectivity. And we're also going to then open up capacity on the 4G network, so that experience should be a little bit better as well. But you know, long story short, we're in the early innings. There's a lot of building that needs to be done, and that's just only on the infrastructure side. That doesn't even take into account, you know, what John has been saying on the software development side.
Yeah, our goal is to have the first CBRS-enabled building deployed in first quarter of 2021. So, you know, in terms of having the infrastructure, and I think it's important for people who are really researching this, that as you look at the radios that need to be deployed, there's some good technology out there that allows a private 4G LTE network to be deployed, but those radios can be upgraded simply by upgrading the software to get you to 5G. So those are the kind of investments, rather than going out, okay, I just deployed, you know, 1,000 radios in a building. Now I need to go take those out and put in new 5G radios. You know, pick the ones where it's a software upgrade and not hardware. So there's really smart decisions that people could be making now that are going to accelerate this as you make these investments.
So I want to be conscious of the fact that we are starting to get close to time here. Is there anything that I have missed that you really want our audience to take away from today's conversation?
I mean, I would just say we've talked about a lot of the challenges and maybe some of the struggles that we're seeing out there. But I also would like to note, like, I mean, there's, you know, some wonderful things that are happening here in the city around connectivity. I think, you know, with this pandemic, as much of a struggle as it's been for so many people, has shown some of the benefits of that we can get from technology and from connectivity. You know, one of my sons does speech OT PT therapy, and you know, used to have to physically go to one center in New York to do that. Same with his colleagues, and now these are kids all over the city, and now I'm hearing actually all over the world that are getting access to these same services that previously you would only be able to get access to if you physically went there. So I think as we open up the doors to connectivity, when we talk about bridging the digital divide, we're going to start opening up opportunity for, you know, what I'm excited about for our children, regardless of what zip code that they're born into, and allow access to medicine and education in a way that just, you know, we couldn't have dreamed about before. So I would say that's what I'm excited about. There's a lot of blocking and tackling, John, I think, as you would say, that I agree, but we're going to get there. And I think it's very exciting. And I fully believe that New York should be all in, focused on developing the opportunity.
Couldn't agree more. This is about everybody.
Yeah, and my last comment would be all about a sense of urgency. You know, sometimes we all work in a 95-mile-an-hour world. We've got to get others that are out there for the sense of success of our future, to really get those that have not been blocking and tackling, as John likes to say, get them engaged fully and get this thing moving. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind, and there's no reason for that.
Great. Well, I want to be conscious of everybody's time, as I mentioned before. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for today's incredibly thoughtful and very important and timely conversation. It's been made very clear that 5G will deliver the connectivity needed to not only strengthen New York's economy, help really revolutionize the real estate industry, and also create brighter futures for millions of families, communities, and businesses across New York, but also nationwide. For anybody watching that wants to learn more, I encourage you to visit NewYorkersFor5G.com. So with that, thank you again, everybody, for your participation this morning, and thank you to all of those who tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye now.
Take care.